start with some of the pictures on a macro scale, and then we'll move into the granular things. And so the panel will help us with the granular things. And I want to talk a little bit about the theory of future-proofing, because essentially there's a lot of things at stake and a lot of different elements and a lot of different agendas that go through that. And I want to start off by talking about having a new perspective on this, because I think that part of what is good to think about with future-proofing is the fact that this information is additive. And what I mean by additive is there are different companies, different agendas, different initiatives, different opinions on what is future-proofing. What is the best way to future-proof? What do you need to future-proof versus what you don't need to future-proof? But what I want to submit to everyone today is the ideal way to do future-proofing is based on the amalgamation of a number of different areas, and one is not necessarily more or less important than the others. A good way to illustrate this is something that comes to us from the automobile industry. So we'll use this as a little illustration. In 1968, up until then, seatbelts weren't mandatory. And at that time, there was this situation where car crashes and car fender benders less than 30 miles an hour had tons of injuries. But in 1968, they said, you know what? If we make this mandatory, we will see a massive decline in injuries based on sub 30 mile an hour collisions. And they were right. And then it took until 1998 in which all of a sudden airbags became standard. And because situations where there were accidents at about 45 to 55 miles an hour, the seatbelts weren't doing enough. And they had all these injuries and fatalities. But once airbags became standard, that had a massive decline. Then in 2011, anti-lock brakes became standardized. And all of a sudden, the ability to stop your car when you lock your wheels started to get a whole bunch more safer. Now, the truth is, we can't control what happens in terms of what accidents may occur. It's unpredictable. And if you're standing and you get T-boned, anti-lock brakes aren't going to help you. Or if you lock up your wheels because of an icy road, a seatbelt isn't necessarily going to help stop your car. But the fact of the matter is, it's the additive properties of these three elements together that actually make cars so safe. And they allow people to keep going and be healthier. Similarly, the challenge of what future-proofing can be very kind of akin to what I just described with automobiles, because what people today that I think is actually disruptive to the industry are reversing this concept of and versus or. And what I mean by that is some people are suggesting that all you need is one element to be future-proof or another or a different one, when the true properties of this should be additive. We need the additive properties of three major components in order to be future-proof. And the first one is future-proof resolution. Now, resolution is something that is going to enable people to be prepared for a future distribution platform that we may not even know yet. There are things that will happen in the future that we can't necessarily predict, and being able to have your resolution checked off helps your future-proof ability of your content, and we need to be doing that today because we already know where some of that future-proof resolution will be in the next decade. So it pays to be prepared today. The second component is future-proof dynamic range. Dynamic range is essentially how bright and how dark your picture can be, the distance between black and white. And future-proof dynamic range is expanding. In fact, there is a technology from Dolby that is 40 times more dynamic range than your standard television and quite a bit more than your standard projection systems. And so as future-proof dynamic range comes about, we need to be able to prepare for that today so that our pictures look accurate, not just stunning, but accurate in the future. And then the third element is future-proofing our color depth. There are groups out there, like the ACES program, that are really adamantly pushing the benefits of wider color so that color gets richer, not just brighter. And color becomes more realistic and not watered down. Now, independently, wide color has amazing properties for making pictures better. More color, more subtleties, is better. And while, and on its own, having more dynamic range is stunning. It creates a more three-dimensional look. It creates something to be a little bit more punctual and look more realistic. And while stunning, also by itself, resolution has incredible characteristics about what pictures can do and how they can hold up on bigger screens, better screens, more dynamic screens, both in the home and in the theaters. But it's really the additive properties of all these together that make something future-proof. And I consider this the tripod of fidelity. Because I believe standing alone, each of these independently are much weaker than when they stand together. Even though each of them are benefits, each of these independently are making a better picture. But together, like seatbelts, airbags, and anti-lock brakes, we can essentially be prepared for virtually anything. And that's exactly what we do here, right? Is to be prepared. So, a little exercise here that I think is kind of a fun little examination. Malcolm Gladwell has a wonderful book called The Tipping Point. The idea behind this book, if you were to water it down, is the law of the few, which essentially means how a few small elements work together that you really can't predict or even control, and then they eventually become something really, really significant, and they have a huge effect on the many. This is a graph of what a tipping point actually looks like. If you were to graph when a product goes through a tipping point, you have on your X and Y axis essentially the effectiveness of a product or a process or something over time versus how it's essentially adapted and adopted into the market. And what the curve looks like is this. When there are very few connections, it's very ineffective. And then all of a sudden, in an extremely small amount of time, the situation begins to tip. And it's inside of this tipping point that a lot of futurists like to examine, how did that happen? Usually, we cannot discern tipping points before they happen. It's very, very hard to predict what's going to tip. But we're going to talk about something, and I think this particular panel is very well poised because we are about to probably experience a tipping point in a lot of how things are distributed, and you probably understand where I might be going with that. An example that we can use for a little bit of a fun exercise. Imagine something like the rise of the iPod. We'll examine that in terms of how it tipped. You remember that there was a time where you never saw an iPod, really never heard of an iPod, never had an iPod, and then all of a sudden everyone had one. Do you remember that? It was the year 2001. And it went from, what is this product, to I have to have one, everyone did overnight. And in this case, the Sony Walkman, which essentially ruled the personal stereo system for over 25 years, essentially evaporated instantly. Now, how did this happen? How could that happen so quickly? Did Apple control the whole thing? Of course not. Because they can't control everything. They try, but they can't control everything. And in that process, one of the ways we can examine that is, first of all, it started with AOL. Do you remember we used to get CDs in the mail with AOL on them? Do you remember that? It's very odd when you think about it now, but you got the CD-ROM and they would mail thousands to you, right? You always had them. You're like, why do I keep getting this, right? So AOL starts moving the internet into the home. Number two, the T1 line is invented. T1 was the first, what at that time we would call high-speed internet. It was not dial-up. It was getting past dial-up. And so we have AOL saturating the market so people can get online. The T1 line starts pushing. Where did T1 lines get the most adaptation the fastest? Universities. Because universities started going online and they bought into the T1 propaganda and they started pushing that. Then a man named Sean Parker invented something called Napster. Once you add together AOL plus the T1 line inside a university and the ability to share music, Apple hits with the iPod and it moves overnight. It tips overnight. Apple didn't control that. They didn't predict that. They didn't know what was going to happen. Sometimes it's just a perfect timing. And that's what happened in that situation. Another example is you would all probably agree that you had never heard of Uber, never knew about Uber, and then all of a sudden you're in an Uber car. How does that happen? Is Uber that good? No, they're not that good. Essentially, what happened with Uber started in the Gulf War. Because in the Gulf War, a new technology of global positioning system to move satellite-guided bombs eventually filtered its way down into consumer electronics. That GPS system then gave way into the world of smartphones. And you all had, I know you all had a Motorola Razr, and then you got rid of your Motorola Razr and you started to get into the smartphone. Then Apple in 2007 released the App Store, and they made an online store where finally software could be bought online. That sounds really rudimentary now, but before that, you never bought software on the internet. And then Google Maps comes along, and they work to build an extremely powerful map system. And when you add all those elements and properties together, starting with those global positioning laser-guided bombs, all of a sudden we have Uber. And Uber comes out with a simple application that takes advantage of all those things, and it tips overnight. Where we're headed into a tipping point now is very critical with future-proofing, because we're about to see, I believe, and these are hard to predict because tipping points typically are evaluated after the market tips because they're hard to predict. But I spend a lot of time trying to evaluate these things so I know where the puck is going to be, because I'm not really interested in where the puck is. And in that process, the OTT groups, the broadbanders, were starting to see a shift from broadcast into broadband. Now, how did it go? How is it going from everyone's using broadcast to all of a sudden broadband has a larger market share in terms of subscription base than cable, all the cable companies combined, to be specific? How is that happening so quickly? Well, I think it has to do with the preparedness that OTT has over future-proofing, because OTT is looking into the future and they're being prepared for it, and that is in response, or at least in concert, to what is happening in the consumer electronics and consumer and audience experience. So how can we prove this? It's hard to prove this because you might be saying, oh, that all sounds pretty good, Michael, but how do you know for sure? Well, I don't know for sure. But I had to find a way to try to see if I could get a little bit more sure of this. And I came up with an idea to go into the future 20 years. What I did is I brought in a whole bunch of film students. Don't try to do this. It's a real pain in the butt, by the way. We brought in a bunch of film students. So these presumably are the best and brightest of what content creators are going to be. Isn't it interesting if we were to understand what is in the mind based on future-proofing technology of a future content creator, wouldn't that give us a little picture of where we need to be, where the puck is going to be versus where it is? And what we did is we showed all these students a picture of today's technologies, and then we showed them a picture of tomorrow's technologies. We showed them today's standard best quality elements. In fact, when I asked them after showing them a demonstration content, what would you rate the quality of this experience? They gave a high definition, standard color system, and standard brightness. They gave it a 9 out of 10. When then I took the images and we showed them high resolution UHD, ultra high definition. We had that with high dynamic range, and we had it with wide color. And when we put those together, we asked them to provide us with a survey. And they gave it, out of 10, a 30. This experience was so unique, and we learned a lot in this experience. And I don't think anyone's ever done an evaluation like this. All of a sudden, there was something really interesting happening. First, almost everyone in the room touched their face. And person after person, when they were experiencing this, was touching their face. And it was very, some of them couldn't even touch their face. There was nothing even there. They couldn't even close their mouth, right? And sociologists will tell you that when you're touching your face, there's a couple of things going on. And it was a really interesting reaction that they weren't even aware they were doing. They were hiding from what they were experiencing. They were literally distancing themselves, sort of like what happens when you see something kind of crazy or horrific. You cover your mouth. They're starting to do that because they're experiencing something so much, they're holding it inside. Their overwhelming majority of emotion that they were showing was joy, was happiness. We were taking the same content they had already seen and putting it in the tripod of fidelity, making it future-proof, and these people were happier. Not only were they that, I did not forget to ask them, are you willing to pay more for this content? And they all said they would. So there's more money to be made with this content as well because they're willing to do that. If you actually want to see that entire experiment, there's a bit.ly link right here, and you can actually watch the entire experiment as we sort of documented it, and we let you listen to their feedback as we ask them questions after each session. So you're welcome to take a look at that. And here's what it boils down to, and we're going to bring up our panel in just a minute, and we're going to take a look at more of the granular components of how to do this and what it means. And I think what I want to set the tone with and hopefully inspire people to understand is a little analysis here. I sometimes call this analysis a sobering truth. If you were to look at, this is not a scaled graphic, this is sort of a made-up scale, so this isn't really measuring anything, but it's sort of an approximation, or at least a visual illustration. If you were to measure the quality of audience display projection in 2012, you were all mastering your content in the professional world at a better experiential level than people could consume. Does what I just said make sense? I know it's wordy, I apologize. But you were all mastering at a better qualitative level than consumers could consume, whether that's in the theater or at home. But unfortunately, in 2016, given the push of the consumer electronics initiatives, which are moving faster than the creative ones in terms of the technological exhibitions, we are now seeing a delta in which now the consumer electronics industry, the consumption ability, the audiences can now consume greater pictures than we are providing them. That has never happened ever in history. Nobody ever had a 35 millimeter home projector that was the equivalent of the quality of what they could see in a movie theater. Nobody had that. It was always working at a lower qualitative component than what the professionals could deliver. But today, consumers have access to the tripod of fidelity. They're beginning to have access in some estimates by the Japanese companies that are pushing it the hardest are over 12 million new hi-fi tripod of fidelity compatible sets over the course of 2016. 12 million new ones. And there are a whole bunch of people that are pushing this, and I think these are people, there's many more than this, but I just have a couple here. Dolby in the cinema market is leading in the high fidelity, high dynamic range, high color, and high resolution. They're doing that in conjunction with Christie Digital Systems. Again, these are not the only ones. I'm just pointing out a few that I think are doing a good job. They are pushing it in the theatrical world with extremely better projection. And then also in the consumer side, LG is doing a great job. Again, not the only one, but they should be celebrated for what they're doing in their OLED display technology for consumers. It's extremely affordable and unbelievably gorgeous. And then, of course, Netflix and Amazon, who deserve some accolades for their pioneering of the high-fidelity, over-the-top exhibition and distribution platform, which is really, really remarkable and very, very new, definitely new territory. We are creatures that like gradual change. We like things to change slowly so we can feel comfortable about planning and predicting them. But unfortunately, when certain components and intersections happen that lead to a tipping point, we don't have time to plan. We have to look ahead, and we've got to think ahead because it's not going to be a gradual change. We also are nearing that tipping point, and I think you're going to see a major change of power and control in how this stuff happens, and you definitely want to be on the right side of history when it does. And lastly, I think it's important to keep an open mind.